Genetics of language use. Things that get inherited. Covariance of language abnormalities within families. Williams syndrome. Selective language impairment. Mendelian inheritance. Vocabulary complexity. Ability to spell. Poor evidence on dyslexia, or learning disorders. FOXP2. Mutation in families with linguistic problems, like problems on language generation speech. FOXP2 is a transcription factor. It affects the cognitive and motoric level of language. It's expressed in the basal ganglia, related to gesturing, facial prosody, etc. FOXP2 in other species. It's in all type of species. But in them it hasn't evolved in a long time. If you remove this gene from a mouse, he has less and simpler vocalization. And it's expressed in motoric parts. In humans, it has evolved very recently, around the last couple of thousands of years. And it changed real fast under selective advantageous conditions. The gene that regulates it, are very differentiated as a result of positive selection. Take out the FOXP2 in a mouse. You put in the human version. And they have more and more complex vocalization. Pidgin language. Slave populations that live in the same areas, but are from different countries, so no one really know each other language. But they have fragments from each language, that both can understand, to try to cooperate. There's no complex grammar, they just use it for kinda communicate. Then, 2 generations later, it emerges into a real language. Creole language. It fits the rules, grammar, etc. But more interesting. All the Creoles around the world, have the same grammatical structure. And it is very well grammatically structured. This raises the notion of a default ancient pattern of grammar built into humans. Also, in sign languages, like the Nicaraguan, it went through a first generation of being Pidgin. And then became into Creole, which has the same grammatical structures. Joseph Greenberg. There's 24 ways in which you can create grammatical structures. And all across the 6,000 languages. You only see 15 of them used. And the majority only use 4 of them. Ecological factors. Very biodiverse ecosystems. Produce cultures with a lot of diversity. Related to polytheism. William Sutherland. More ecological diversity equals more linguistic diversity. Sadly, linguistic diversity is dying faster than biodiversity. In this century, 90% of languages will extinct. Evolution of language. Click languages. Hunter-gatherers in Africa. Is the first types of languages. Also found in Aboriginal groups on Australia. Which suggest convergent evolution. Selection issues. Advantages of language. It's easy to store knowledge/information. To coordinate hunts. To know what you did in difficult times. Language is how we outsmart plants. It's all about sequence. Which leads to the construction of tools also. Where logical sequential transitions and construction of tools emerged in parallel. Cooperation. Kin selection. Reciprocal altruism. We can lie. Also, there's a huge disproportionate share of neurons in the motor system devoted to facial expressions, mouth coordination. Because if you want to lie, it's better to have control over your facial expressions. Better communication equals more wins in game theory. The rarest the grammatical structures equals are closest to extinction. Schizophrenia. When you talk to a person with it, they're not thinking normally. Disease of thought disorder. Inappropriate emotions. Inappropriate attribution of things. Where the typical structures don't work right in their behavior. Subtypes. Heterogeneous disease. Paranoid schizophrenia. Thought disorder built around a sense of persecution. Catatonic schizophrenia. The person is immobile for long periods of time. Schizoaffective disorder. Schizophrenia plus depression. Disease of cognitive abnormalities, of abnormal sequential thought. Loose associations or tangential thinking. Sequential thinking is greatly impaired. They can't follow a sequence telling a history, etc. Getting caught by a loose association between the sound of the word and its multiple meanings. Abstraction. We know how concrete/abstract the information that we're getting is. People with schizophrenia have no intuition to get the right level of abstraction. They interpret things far more concretely. Concreteness of thought. Test to prove schizophrenia. Association task. What does these things have in common? Apple, orange, banana. And they'll say. All of them are multisyllabic words. Or. What's on your mind today's? He. My hair. Or. Can you write me a sentence, any sentence? And he writes. Can you write me a sentence, any sentence? Proverb tests. They're metaphorical, abstract. Schizophrenics can't get out of the most concrete level of interpretation of it. You say, what means, a rolling stone gathers no moss. And he say, stones rolling down hills, it's very hard for plants to grow on them. Or, loose lips sink ships. You ask him what does it means. And he imagine big lips coming out of the water, destroying ships. Delusions. Belief in things that cannot be. He says, do you know the Wall of China? Yes. He says, my idea, the generals came to me, and I told them to put it there. Paranoia. Because if their world makes no sense, it must be very threatening. Hallucinations. Most hallucinations are auditory. They hear voices. Maybe because we're more accustomed to visual stuff, which makes us more vulnerable to sounds. Those hallucinations are structured, have content. And there's even the most common voices here by schizophrenics. 1. Jesus. 2. Satan. 3. Current president. Social withdrawal. Abnormal social affiliation. They're ostracized, alone. At the moment, most of the research has focused to cure the hallucinations. But it seems that the real problem are the tangents thought, concreteness, loose associations. Physiologically. You see damping of autonomic nervous system. Schizophrenia and Violence. 1990s. At Berkeley. A schizophrenic student held hostage some women at a bar. And did sexually abusive things before he killed himself after killing a few of them. But schizophrenics are far less dangerous than normal individuals in society. The rates of violence are extremely low. Except when they damage themselves. There are even studies that show the most mutilated parts of their body. 1. Genitals. 2. Breasts. 3. Thighs. 1990s. Columbia Medical School. Someone had a schizophrenic break, and went to home. He thought he was satanically possessed. And Satan was telling him obsessive sexual thoughts. He was an endocrinologist, so he thought, in order to get rid of those thoughts, he needed to get rid of testosterone. So, he castrated himself. But he also knew that the adrenal glands also generate testosterone. So, he proceeded an adrenalectomy into himself. He sterilized with alcohol. Made an incision without anesthetic. And a mirror angle to see what he was doing. At some point, he hit a blood vessel, and started bleeding out. Then he went to ER at Columbia Presbyterian. And said, "Hi guys, I'm trying to take out my adrenals and I'm having a problem here with it, can you give me a hand?" 1960s. A minority view in psychiatry said, schizophrenia is not so bad, it has hidden blessings. Schizophrenia is the disease of being healthy in a crazy world. Ronald Lang said, we shouldn't be medicating or hospitalizing them, it's a blessing. Andrew Wilde wrote, The Hidden Blessings of Schizophrenia. They even created a movie, King of Hearts, where someone released the schizophrenics because they were sane people. After this, people discharged schizophrenics. And half of schizophrenics attempted suicide. More remission equals more likely to suicide. Because the more they're clear-headed to see their life, the more likely to suicide. One of the darkest episodes of biology. Schizophrenia and aging. While they become older, the positive symptoms disappear. Hallucination, delusions, loose associations are gone. Affect and withdrawal increases. It has late adolescence, early adulthood onset. If you make it to age 30 without schizophrenia, you have virtually no chance of ever having it. Schizophrenic breaks begin as response to major stressors. They were a little bit odd. Had imaginary playmates far later than other kids. Not pay attention, lost in their own thoughts. Trouble making friends. And doing okay. But if they got a car accident, his partner was so horrible to them. A parent died. Or whatever major stressors. That's where things start to happen. Schizophrenia is very anchored in the frontal cortex, which is fully developed around age 25. Where the last big burst of frontal maturation occurs in late adolescence or early adulthood. Which suggests that around late adolescence, a fragile, vulnerable frontal cortex gets kicked once too hard and that's where the problems emerge. Demography. 1 to 2% of the whole population has it. No gender differences. No social economic status difference. Most of individuals who are homeless are schizophrenics, not alcoholics. There's psychiatrist who diagnoses schizophrenia to political dissidents, to people who want to get rid of schizophrenia in other cultures. Maasai tribe, nomadic pastoralists. Boys around 10 become warriors. Spend 10 years being warriors. Get killed around 25. If they survive, they marry a 13-year-old. Life expectancy of 30s. They believe in the paranormal. Drink tureens of cow blood in their celebrations. 1980s. A Maasai woman, socially isolated, killed a goat. She grabbed the goat, and ripped its throat open with her teeth. Sapolsky went to see what was happening. When he arrived, he saw a naked woman with a goat in her mouth by the throat, covered in goat blood, urine, and shit. She gives a howling yell, knocks Sapolsky, and attempts to strangle him. The people around helped him. Then they took the woman and put her in the jeep of Sapolsky. They drive to a government clinic. But they wanted to get rid of her. At the end, Sapolsky asked the people there what was the problem with her. And they say, she hears voices. But Sapolsky wasn't impressed because they hear voices when they do their rituals and that sort of things. But they say, she hears voices at the wrong time. And this winds up telling us that across cultures, there's a different sense of what counts as normal behavior, and abnormal behavior. And that's why it's so hard for psychiatrists to give an accurate diagnosis about schizophrenia. Neurochemistry of schizophrenia. Dopamine hypothesis. An excess of dopamine winding up in the synapses. Evidence. Look at the levels of dopamine breakdown products in the bloodstream, urine, cerebral spinal fluid, etc. Tend to be elevated. All the drugs against schizophrenia block dopamine receptors. Antipsychotic, neuroleptics, Haldol, Thorazine, etc. If you give schizophrenics dopamine, or any drug that activates dopamine receptors, their symptoms get worse. Look post-mortem at their brains. And there's elevated levels of dopamine receptors in the frontal cortex. So, too much dopamine coming out. Or too many dopamine receptors. Or, dopamine is broken down by COMT, which is an enzyme. If that enzyme doesn't work very well, dopamine accumulates. And there's evidence of abnormalities for this enzyme. In 18 counties of the brain where dopamine's got something to do with it, dopamine serves another role. In a motor system related to the basal ganglia, involved in fine motor control. Substantia nigra. If you get little damage equals tremor of old age. Too much damage equals Parkinson's, where 90% of substantia nigra die. These are dopaminergic neurons. In Parkinson's you lose all the dopamine signaling. In 60s, they start giving patients replacement dopamine. It's hard to get dopamine in the brain, so they give people one step earlier in the biosynthesis. A drug LDOPA, which then gets converted into dopamine. LDOPA helped people with Parkinson's. Movie Awakenings. About a disease that emerged after WW1. Related to the influenza pandemic. A post-encephalitic paralysis, the stiff man syndrome. People were essentially frozen in place. Due to an autoimmune disorder that targets the dopamine system. Where Oliver Sacks used LDOPA to cure people with this syndrome. Downsides. You got a problem with dopamine in the substantial nigra. Lower levels of dopamine in the substantia nigra, but you everywhere in the brain have normal levels. If you give them LDOPA, you rise dopamine levels in the substantia nigra, but you raise it everywhere else in the brain. So, if you give too much LDOPA to someone with Parkinson's, he becomes psychotic. More dopamine levels equals acts schizophrenic. That's what amphetamines do. Flip side. Schizophrenics, if you give them these neuroleptic drugs to block dopamine receptors in the frontal cortex, you lower his dopamine signaling levels in the cortex, but also in everywhere else gets lower than normal. As a result, if you overmedicate schizophrenics, they look as if they have Parkinson's, a disorder called tardive dyskinesia. All evidence suggests too much dopamine in this disease. But there's an anti-schizophrenic drug, which increases dopamine signaling, and people get better. So, we don't know. What do the excess of dopamine? It doesn't have anything to do with movement, that's substantia nigra. Not with pleasure, that's dopamine in different parts of the brain. This is dopamine functioning in the frontal cortex, stimulating normal executive function. So, you've got a frontal cortex that not make any sense, loose associations, that's where the dopamine problem is played out. Other neurotransmitters involved. Serotonin. The chemical structure of serotonin is almost identical to the structure of the major hallucinogens. LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, etc. And all of those hallucinogens fit into serotonin receptors and activate them. Hallucination induced by a drug. Passive serotonin synapse - a hallucinator drug that looks like serotonin - binds to serotonin receptors equals hears voices, hallucinations, etc. This gives rise to possible abnormalities in serotonin in schizophrenia. Glutamate. If you take a drug that stimulate a subtype of glutamate receptor, you look a bit like a schizophrenic. PCP, phencyclidine. In rats, if you stimulate the brain with PCP, receptors of serotonin increase. But the dopamine hypothesis is the most reliable. What happened to the brain during a hallucination? Wild activity everywhere in the brain equals hallucination. But it never stimulates the primary sensory cortex, it only activates the last layers of the cortex. So, during hallucinations you see extreme high levels of metabolism throughout the brain. If you give schizophrenics some declarative memory tasks, the metabolism in their hippocampus doesn't increase as normal. Hallucinations follow kinda the same pattern of dreams. The primary sensory cortex regions are shut down. Frontal cortex is relatively quiet. And the rest of the brain is going like mad. Structures of schizophrenia. Structural abnormalities in the brain of schizophrenics. Years before, the only way to see the abnormalities was looking at brains of schizophrenics post-mortem. But they're not highly reliable. Because you can't really measure all the things that actually happened in their brain. And even in some medical centers, they had rapid autopsy teams to get as fast as they can the brain. Also, schizophrenics have terrible diets. So maybe if you see an abnormality, it might be due to malnutrition. Also, they've been using a lot of drugs. So, it might change their brain as well. That's why researchers love unmedicated schizophrenics. On patients with onset of schizophrenia, they do a lot of tests. More recently, brain imaging has been used in living patients. Findings. Ventricles, they're cavities running through the brain, filled with cerebral spinal fluid. In schizophrenia there's enlargement of the ventricles. The skull isn't going anywhere, thus, something else has to be getting smaller. So, there's contraction compression of the cortex, cortical compression. Hippocampus. Pyramidal neurons. Neurons pyramidally shaped. They're organized in layers, and send all their projections to the next cell layer, they are diamond shaped. And there's fewer hippocampal neurons, and some are facing the wrong way, they're sending projections where they're not supposed to. Frontal cortex. Few neurons, or fewer glia, or fewer both. Low levels of a neuron called rillin, involved in cortical maturation. So, you're not getting a normal final burst of frontal maturation. Thalamus. Tends to be atrophied. Genetics. Schizophrenia is the first psychiatric disease that show evidence for a genetic component to it. Identical twins 50% heritability. Full sibling 25%. Half sibling 12%. Random person on the street 1 to 2%. Also, close relatives of schizophrenics have mild versions of thought disorder. Which means, not all relatives of schizophrenics have these abnormalities, but they might occur. Genetic markers. You find a stretch of DNA, and inside that stretch, is a gene pertinent to the disease. And people with the disease have a different version than the other persons. But you don't know what the gene is or where it is. 80s. Studies on the Amish. But each study was getting different markers. 2010s, actual genes. Variants in the version of COMT. The enzyme that degrades dopamine. Only small effects. -3 different groups of scientists. They did SNP analysis. With thousands of people in the study. And the 3 groups found one common genetic abnormality. In genes of the major histocompatibility complex MHC. Which has to do with cell signatures and immune defenses. Produce huge effects. But nobody has a clear idea. Disc 1. But nobody really knows. Macro mutations. Different number of copies of a gene. Where all sorts of genes in schizophrenia pop up with abnormal number of copies of the gene. Rather than abnormalities in the gene itself. We don't know yet. Because it's not a disease, it's a whole bunch of heterogeneous diseases. Thus, very different genetic components on each case. Early experience. 1. Prenatal stress. People who were fetus during DHW. Have a higher rate of schizophrenia. Famine in China 1959 to 1961. High schizophrenia. Rats. Expose them prenatally to lotta of glucocorticoids equals high levels of dopamine in their frontal cortex. Birth trauma, like brief hypoxia. High schizophrenia. Also, identical twins. They can either share one single placenta, or have one for each one, monochorionic or dichorionic. Where monochorionic twins are more likely to have schizophrenia. Bad gene plus more stressful developmental environment equals more chances of schizophrenia. Bad gene plus zero stress equals no schizophrenia. 2. Parenting style. 1950s. Schizophrenogenic mothering. Raising a kid with distorted, contradictory, fragmented emotional demands from the schizophrenogenic mother, and out comes schizophrenia. Then, the first drug for schizophrenia came out. The neuroleptics, the dopamine receptor blockers. And over the next few years, 90% of the hospital beds in USA for psychiatric patients were emptied out. Until that point, people realized that parenting style has nothing to do with it, it's a biochemical disorder. Nonetheless, a paper showing abnormalities or oddities in the way communication worked in the families of schizophrenics, communication deviance. Where parents, siblings, immediate family, they have an odd communicative style, avert telescope terse, broken phrase style of communication. 3. Being exposed to infectious things. More chances to be schizophrenic, if the mother was exposed to different viruses in third trimester of pregnancy. And when you look at genomes of schizophrenics, they have higher rate of viral DNA, retroviruses. Neonatal viral infections. A protozoan parasite, Toxoplasma gondii. Toxoplasma reproduces in the gut of cats - comes out in cat feces - rodents eat the feces equals rodents, and Toxo had to figure out how to get inside cat stomach. So Toxo makes rats begin to like the smell of cats, and soon they're inside the cat. People who are infected with Toxo have higher rate of mild neuropsychological disinhibition. Little problems with frontal regulation of behavior. Higher chances of serious car accidents. Higher chances of depression. Attempting suicide. Impulsivity. With no big effects. But also, Toxo exposure increases the risk of schizophrenia. How you put it together. Adolescent stress. Prenatal viruses. Enlarged ventricles. Genetic abnormalities, etc. But we don't know how to put them together. Evolution of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia in other species? No. Animals that start acting schizophrenic get eaten that evening. How schizophrenia evolved? By the rules of Darwin. Schizophrenia is maladaptive. They have lower reproductive rate. So, it should be a trait being selected against. Nonetheless, you see historical records that seems like schizophrenia, where now 1 to 2% of the population have it. Thus, there are circumstances where schizophrenia is adaptive. Schizophrenia have lower incidence of certain types of cancers, in particular, lung and throat. Also, sometimes you see a not full-blown schizophrenia, it's a milder version that you see in some of the relatives, which is highly adaptive.